So I have this guy over here. And I would sculpt using those 3 features I mentioned to this stage. So once I'm at this stage, what I like to do is I like to Z-remesh my model. And why am I doing that now? Why don't I do it later? Because I'm not going to waste time adding detail now, right? I mean, I can always add detail later. What I want is a very optimized geometry that's going to let me pose my model easily. If I were to pose this model, it would be hard because I'm working with a lot of geometry over here. So I'm going to Z-remesh this model. And you do that by going to Geometry, Zremesher, and there's a whole bunch of features here. I'm just going to show you guys real quick what Zremesher does, right? So this is just a rough setting that tells you if you want more or less geometry. Let's go with something like 3, and then I'm going to click Zremesher. Now Zremesher is going to analyze my geometry surface, and it's going to create edge flow that is the most suitable for my model. And this is crazy because the results are pretty amazing. And then sometimes these models are good enough to rig and animate. So you're going to see like an edge loop going down here. You're going to see a nice ring of edges going across that hand over there. There you go. As you can see, we have really nice topology. We have edge loops going across that armor piece, right? We have a ring of edges following that curve. You know, we also have like really good topology to work with, right? And once you have this, there's still other things you can do with Zremesher. You can choose to add more detail to his face, right? And you can do that by going to use polypaint, and then start painting a solid red color. And that Zremesher is gonna look at that red, and it's gonna understand that, okay, I want more resolution to be on his face, right? So that's one of the ways you can choose where to add more geometry. So once I have that, I am going to, this is my Z-remeshed model. I'm going to start subdividing and continue working on this sculpt, right? But usually what you want to do is, okay, this is our original Dynamesh, and this is our Z-remesh, right? So you can see when we Z-remesh, the model gets a bit soft, and with every subdivision, you see that it's losing a bit of that detail. So what do you do? What you normally do is to just subdivide once, and then make sure your original Dynamesh is on. So if we take a look, you can see that it's intersecting each other, and we're going to reproject that detail. And what this does is it's going to look at any visible subtools, and it's going to project that detail outwards. I'm going to go up one more subdivision level. I'm going to go project again. Right? You can see slowly we are getting pretty close to our original Dynamesh model. So if we compare the two, this is our Dynamesh model, and that's the Z-remeshed model. The only difference is we have good topology for this guy, and this is a lot easier to pose, right? If I were to rotate his head really quickly, you can see with that kind of topology, it's really easy to pose, right? Whereas with the Dynamesh model, that's way too dense to work with, right? So that's one of the things I always do. I make sure I have subdivision levels for my sculpts, and then once I'm at this stage, I start to add detail. And there's a couple of things you can do. You can use, I keep using the same brushes as well, but some things you can do is you can use alphas, and alphas is a quick way of creating detail on your model. So let's look at some of the default alphas. You've got a nice spatter brush, you've got this nice veiny pattern, and I'm going to use that. I'm just going to show you guys what that does. Let me subdivide one more time. You can see it's adding a lot of micro detail to my model, right? But that isn't what we want. Let's say I wanted that brush to spatter across my model. I can go to my stroke mode over here, and I can choose spatter. And you can see the result is way more random, right? I can switch to a different alpha. Now that's going to give me a nice scaly look. Or you can create your own alphas, right? So these are some of the alphas we have in ZBrush. You can see you've got some wrinkle pattern, you've got bumpy skin. And let's see how that works out. You can see it's creating a nice bumpy texture, right? And you can use this together with masking. So in ZBrush, we've got a whole list of ways you can mask your model, right? You can do mask by cavity. And what that does is it's going to analyze the model and look for all those cavities, and it's going to mask those areas out. So if I have that masked, this lets me view my masking, right? So I have that masked now, and when I sculpt my detail, you see it's not going to affect those creases over there, right? So this is one of the ways I create detail without affecting the existing forms. And when I'm at this stage of adding detail, you can choose to work directly on your model, or you can use layers. And what layers is it's like Photoshop layers. You can create a layer, and you can sculpt your detail on that layer, right? So let's say I'm going to do that, and and then I'm like, you know what, that's too much. That's way too strong. I can go to my layer, and I can reduce that intensity, right? Or I can increase it. Or if I want it to be more than that, I can duplicate that layer, right? So you can see this gives you a lot of flexibility, and it gives you the opportunity to go back and forth between your model. You don't have to get stuck with adding detail with your model. If I feel like, okay, this is way too much, I'm just going to delete that, retain what I have, you know? And if I can even use morph targets, right? So I have this model. I'm going to go to morph target. I'm going to store a morph target. I'm going to turn that layer back on. And then I'm going to click on record. And I can start bringing back that original morph target by selecting my morph brush and cleaning up those areas. So what the morph brush is doing is basically restoring that original morph target we made. So that's a pretty cool way of working. You know, if you feel like this is too uniform, you want to add a bit of randomness, you can use the morph brush, you can use the spatter, and you can start just softening things up a bit, right? So that's how I go about adding detail. There are other things as well. You can just go in manually and start creating wrinkles. You know, sometimes that's required. You know, sometimes you need to add something that's more random, and that's fine as well. You can work on layers as well when you're adding stuff like that. So when I'm done, you would have something like this, right? So I'm refining a lot of the forms here, and once I'm at this stage, you could call it done depending on the size of your print. Sometimes, this is what I do, right? When I'm sculpting for print, the most important thing to note and to understand is how big you're printing it. Because if you're printing it really small and you start adding all this detail, it's not going to show up, right? And then there's the other thing about molding and casting. So if you are making copies of your 3D print, you have to take into account the shrinkage of your silicone mold, right? So every time you mold a copy out of your silicone mold, it's going to impact that mold, and it's going to cause shrinkage in your model. So when I'm sculpting for a piece that I want to make resin copies of, I tend to make everything more bulbous, you know, so that it has more volume, and that compensates for the shrinkage. I do the same thing with adding detail. If you look at Rakshasa, that guy has a lot of detail, right? And it might look a bit too much. right? It might look like I'm overdoing it in certain areas, right? But all of that actually showed up in the print. So those are some things to take note of. Make sure you don't do stuff like that. You know, that's not going to fly. That is never going to mold. So if you want to add spikes, make sure they have a bit of volume. And something I've been doing a lot, if I want to add a spike, let's say I wanted to add a spike that's, let's say, this long, right? And that's going to be hard to mold. It's going to be tricky unless you have a really experienced molder. What I do is I try to integrate supports to my design and try to hide them. So you can reinforce this spike by adding more volume to the back, you know. The design is going to change fine, yeah, but you know what, at this point I'd rather have a model that's going to print well, that I'm not going to worry about parts breaking off, you know. And honestly, you know, it doesn't look that bad. So that's something to take note of. If you're making really tiny pieces or even like really thin fins, right? What I do is just add more volume, just to add more support so that when copies are made, these pieces are not going to break easily. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to show you guys how to create keys and joints, right? So it's important to know how to do this because sometimes, let's say if you have a very small printer, you're not able to print this entire model in one go. You need to split his head apart. Or there are certain undercuts, or for instance, like let's say I had Geo that was like that, right? And that kind of undercut, I would have to break out my model into a separate piece like that, because I'm not able to mold the entire piece with that kind of shape in my model. So the first thing I do is to assign your polygroups, right? And how do you go about doing that? There are a couple of ways. You can go mass lasso, you can select, and then hit Control W. So that automatically adds a polygroup to it. And a polygroup is just a series of groups that lets you manage your models. So if I were to hide, I can work between different polygroups, you see? So that's one way of splitting it up. So here I have my polygroup, right? And when I was doing this, I'm always like looking at the inside. I'm going to show you guys real quick how to do that. You just go to display properties, turn on double, and that lets you look at the interior. So this gives you a good idea of how that cut is going to be like, right? We're going to re-Dynamesh it, and then this whole area is going to get covered. So if we look at the other piece, so what we are looking out for is to try to get as straight a line as possible. We don't want anything too uneven, and you can see that the outline is very jagged, right? And that's because we add a polygroup, and that automatically splits these two pieces without creating a new geometry in between. So to do that, we want a straight line across those jaggies. What we can do is using group loops. So that is under geometry, I believe, under edge loop and group loops. So what group loops does, it's going to add a loop of edges along that line, and in that process, it is going to smoothen out that intersection. So you can see we immediately have a row of edges along that intersection. Right? But the thing is, when you do this, there's a tendency for group loops to soften your model. And why it does that? Because there's a polish feature here that helps smoothen that row of edges. So if you compare this new geo with our our previous geo, you see we're losing a lot of detail again. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to select our edge loop model, and we're going to turn off all the other subtools. We're going to make sure these two guys are on, right? And then we are going to reproject that detail back onto our new geo. So now we have our new polygroup assigned model, and if you compare it with the previous one, it's pretty similar. And what we're going to do next is, remember how I wanted two polygroups? We're going to have to split that line, that two rows of edges into two. So I can do that by hiding this polygroup and then hiding the head. And then I'm going to make sure I have select lasso on, and I'm going to select just a row of edges. And I can do that by using select lasso and clicking on an edge. So that hides that row of edges. I'm going to polygroup that row, and then immediately I have two separate rows, right? So I'm going to group these two polygroups together and those two together. I'm going to hide these two guys, group it, and then I'm going to hide this new group and group the other two. So immediately we have a better seam line, right? And when we re-Dynamesh, it's going to give us a much more cleaner result. So what you can do next, right, once you have this, is you can re-Dynamesh your model, right? But before we re-Dynamesh, you have to make sure you have the groups option turned on. Make sure group is turned on. You want to make sure project is on, and make sure blur is at 0. So project is going to keep all of those existing details. Group is actually going to split those two models into two. So I increase the resolution, make something like, I don't know, maybe like 1200. And I'm going to re-Dynamesh. So this process is going to break out those two groups into two different objects, and it's going to cap that hole. So you can see we have all of this is getting capped, right? That's getting capped as well. And the seam line is pretty minor. You're not going to see it unless you're printing this huge like that, but you know. So once we have that, what we can do next is we can break these two into two different subtools, and we can start adding joints. So I can split these two subtools by going to split, group split. So that's going to break my two objects into two separate subtools. And the reason for adding joints is so that when you attempt to reconstruct your figure, it's going to fit nicely with the other parts, right? And it's really simple to do this. Usually before I start doing this, I like to duplicate my subtools just in case anything goes wrong. Yeah, Jared is nodding his head. He's like, yeah. You know, and we can use an insert brush. So I have it here, key joint. So this is just a tapered sphere. I am going to insert it over there, right, like so. I'm going to use my transpose line. By clicking on this surface, it's going to align itself perpendicular to that surface. And I'm going to make sure that this is dragged in. And I can constrain my movement by holding onto the shift. So if I hold on to shift, I'm actually constraining my movement along that axis. So I'm going to make sure that fits in over there. And at this stage, depending on your printer software, some printer softwares, they allow multiple objects together and they print fine. Some other printer software requires your model to be watertight. So if your printer software requires it to be model tight, what you have to do is we have to re-Dynamesh it, right? And then I can do that by going give it a lower resolution, and just re-dynameshing. So you can see this is one continuous mesh now. So that's a really quick way of combining your meshes if your printer doesn't support multiple objects. So now we have our body. We have our body piece. And what we need to do is we need that joint to cut out a hole in our body piece. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my head piece. I'm going to move it so that it's right underneath my body piece over here. So that's my body, and then that's my, my head piece with the joints, right? In fact, I'm going to use this guy, right? And there are a couple of Boolean options here. So I'm going to click on that option. That's going to let me intersect the above model. Okay, but before doing that, I need to merge these two subtools together. And when I do that, ZBrush is going to understand that I want this piece to cut out that piece. And again, before doing this, make sure you duplicate so you have your original head model. Then I'm going to go merge down. Oops, that was, you see what I just did? That was wrong, bad. Okay, so we have that piece over there, then we have that piece, then I'm going to merge this guy down. Right? And then what I'm going to do next is I'm going to re-dynamesh this model. So you see what that does is it immediately cuts out a perfect circle, perfect joint for your other piece. And if we move this guy out, you can see this is a perfect form-fitting, perfect for just molding and casting copies. You know, that head piece is going to fit perfectly in that body piece over there. It's not going to nudge, it's not going to do anything. And that's the reason why this is tapered, right? And again, that is to accommodate for the shrinkage. Whenever you make a resin copy, your model tends to shrink. And if you had something that was like a perfect square, you know, if it expands or it shrinks, it's not going to fit perfectly. So by doing a tapered shape like that, it's going to give you some leeway to work with, right? And in any case, if there is some kind of shrinkage in your model, what you can then do is just simply just sand off, you know, just make sure this is slightly smaller and you can jot it back into that. So that's pretty much it for my presentation. If you guys have any questions, feel free to drop by and ask me. But that's pretty much what I do to create some of my collectibles and some of my resin statues. Thanks a lot, guys.